What do you do when silence becomes your final strength? You loved her. That's not in question. You gave your time, your energy, your soul, sometimes even at the cost of your peace. You were always the one who reached out first, who forgave first, who broke the silence after every storm. She knew that. She expected it. And maybe that's exactly why she stopped appreciating it. Familiarity breeds comfort, and comfort, unchecked, breeds entitlement. She started assuming you'd always be there, that no matter how many times she pulled away, you'd chase. No matter how often she withdrew, you'd fill the space. But something shifted inside you, didn't it? A quiet moment, a realization. And suddenly, you didn't reach out. You didn't explain. You didn't beg. You just went silent, not out of anger, not to play games, but because you had finally reached a place of peace too deep to disturb. A peace born not from having control over her, but from having control over yourself. And that silence? It thundered through her world. She didn't expect it. She didn't believe you would really let go, not forever, not without a scene, a final goodbye, a dramatic exit. But that's the thing about true interchange. It doesn't need a show. It just happens. Quietly, completely. Your silence wasn't empty. It was full of meaning. It was years of unspoken hurt, unreturned energy, unnoticed effort, all wrapped in a single, undeniable message: I'm done explaining my worth. That is what makes silence powerful. When it comes from a place of strength, not spite. When it no longer seeks to teach someone a lesson, but to protect your soul. She thought you'd come back. She counted on the old you. The one who needed closure, who feared being misunderstood, who couldn't stand the thought of her being upset. But you outgrew that version, and doing so, you became untouchable. That's why this silence matters. Because it's not just about her. It's about you. It's about who you're becoming, the version of you who no longer needs validation to feel seen, who no longer begs for attention to feel loved, who realizes that peace is worth more than proving a point. You didn't go silent because you didn't care. You went silent because you finally did, about your healing, your energy, your future. And here's why you need to stay, because this isn't the end. It's the beginning. This silence, it's not emptiness. It's a doorway, a turning point, the quiet just before your rise, the space where you stop surviving and start building something unshakable. Stay, because what comes next is everything she never expected, and everything you've been waiting for. She thought silence meant weakness, that your silence was a pause, temporary, uncertain, fragile. But real silence, the kind that's born from self-respect, is the opposite. It doesn't beg. It doesn't wait. It doesn't hope for recognition. It simply exists with calm certainty. You see, Stoicism is not about being cold. It's about being grounded. It's the quiet strength that refuses to be shaken. It's the voice inside that says, I am enough, even if no one claps for me. That's the kind of silence you've stepped into. The kind that makes people stop and realize they can no longer access what they once took for granted. You didn't go quiet because you lacked feelings. You went quiet because your feelings no longer controlled you. You stepped back because you understood that not every connection deserves to be fought for endlessly, especially when the fight is one-sided. Emotional maturity isn't about how much you give. It's about knowing when to stop giving to people who only take. And when you reach that point, silence isn't an escape. It's a boundary, one that says, I'm no longer available for disrespect. I'm no longer participating in cycles that hurt me. This is what she didn't expect. She didn't expect you to detach without drama. She didn't expect the peace you've cultivated to be louder than any confrontation. That's the power of the Stoic response. It holds no bitterness, yet it leaves a mark. It's not loud, yet it shifts the energy. And in that shift, something inside her begins to unravel. Because now, for the first time, she's alone with her actions, with the weight of every moment she thought wouldn't matter, every word, every delay, every dismissal. Now there's nothing left to blame, just silence, just space, just the realization that you're not waiting anymore. That silence of yours, it creates reflection, not just for her, but for you. Because silence is where self-awareness grows. It's where you begin to see the difference between love and attachment, between loyalty and self-betrayal, between holding on and finally letting go. And once you see that, there's no going back. You don't crave her validation anymore. You don't need her to understand. You don't even need closure. Because you gave yourself the one thing she never could, freedom. And the reward for your silence? Peace. Clarity, power, Not the kind that dominates others, but the kind that makes you whole again. The kind that doesn't shout to be noticed but stands so strong it can't be ignored. You didn't go silent forever out of pride. You did it because you're done being pulled in directions that don't align with your growth. And now, the silence is not an ending. It's your awakening, a signal that you've risen above the noise, that your life is no longer on pause, waiting for her to notice. You've pressed play, and this time the story is yours. She was certain you'd come back, not because of your weakness, but because of your history. The version of you she remembered was always willing to forgive, always trying to fix what broke, even when you were the one left bleeding. That version gave endlessly, hoping love would be enough to change what wouldn't change. She relied on that. She believed you were too loyal to ever walk away without turning back. But the truth is, loyalty without limits becomes self-abandonment. And once you wake up to that reality, you can't unsee it. You realize that staying where you're not respected isn't love. It's fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of starting over. Fear of losing someone who already lost you long before they noticed. What she never expected was your growth. Not surface growth, not forced detachment, but the deep, grounded transformation that comes from emotional clarity. You didn't just walk away. You outgrew the space that kept you small. You didn't just get quiet. You healed the part of you that felt the need to explain your worth. That's what changed the entire dynamic. Because silence isn't powerful by accident. It's powerful when it's chosen, when it's backed by peace, when it's no longer reactive but reflective. And now, your lack of response is the response. Not to punish, but to protect. You no longer play the role of the emotional safety net. You don't chase. You don't over-explain. You don't try to be understood by someone who chose not to listen when it mattered. That shift is what breaks patterns. And when patterns break, control is lost. She no longer holds the emotional upper hand. She can no longer predict your behavior. That unpredictability creates a psychological void, one where doubt, regret, and curiosity grow fast. Not because you manipulated her, but because your absence has more integrity than her presence ever did. This is your strength now, not in what you say, but in what you no longer allow. Not in what you feel, but in what you no longer feed. You've learned the rare art of staying silent when you're tempted to speak, of holding your energy when everything in you wants to release it. That's the test. That's the transformation. When you can walk away without making noise. When your silence is so loud it creates a storm in someone else's world, yet brings calm to your own. You're not the same man anymore, the one who needed her to see your value. You've already seen it for yourself. And when you see your own value clearly, you no longer accept being overlooked. You no longer fear letting go. You embrace it. Because what you've stepped into is more than silence, it's sovereignty. It's the moment when your voice is no longer wasted on people who stopped listening, and your energy is finally invested in the life you were always meant to live. The mind always searches for what it can no longer reach. That's the hidden cost of taking someone for granted. The moment they stop reaching back, their silence becomes the loudest presence in the room. You were once available at every moment. She knew where to find your attention, your forgiveness, your softness. It was always there, like a light left on in case she ever felt lost. But now the light is off. Not because you stopped caring, but because you finally started caring about yourself more. That change didn't come from bitterness. It came from clarity, the kind of clarity that shows you how much you've tolerated, excused, and accepted in the name of hope. And hope is powerful, but it's not a strategy. You waited long enough for change. You gave more than enough chances. What you needed wasn't more patience. It was more peace. And peace never comes when you're constantly trying to be seen by someone who only looks when you leave. That cycle ends now because you've learned something unshakable. The one who controls their attention controls their life. You no longer offer your presence to situations that drain you. You no longer explain your absence to people who made you feel invisible when you were right there. That is what makes your silence different now. It doesn't come from confusion. It comes from wisdom, from knowing your worth in the absence of applause, from seeing your value without needing permission to feel valuable. And that truth hits differently. It doesn't just affect her. It changes the way you see everything. You don't chase clarity from people who only create confusion. You no longer beg for peace from those who only brought chaos. You've stopped expecting closure from someone who never gave consistency. That realization isn't cold. It's clean, pure, grounded. And in that grounded state, your silence becomes magnetic. Not because you're trying to attract anything, but because stillness always reveals strength. You're not proving anything anymore. You're simply embodying a man who no longer leaks energy in the wrong directions. That's rare, that's powerful, that's unforgettable, and it forces the world around you to adjust, because when you level up internally, everything around you either rises to meet you or falls away on its own. She feels that shift. She may not say it, but she feels the absence of your energy, your presence, your devotion. And that absence teaches more than your words ever could. You don't need to convince anyone anymore. You don't need to repeat yourself. The message is clear. Access to you is no longer automatic. It's earned. Your silence isn't the absence of love. It's the presence of self-respect. And the man who walks in self-respect walks in power. You've entered that power now. Quiet, unshaken, fully awake. And the world, especially the people who once overlooked you, can feel it. There's something deeply unsettling about losing control over someone you once thought would always stay, especially when they don't leave with noise or anger, but with peace. That's what you've done. You didn't argue your way out. You didn't beg to be seen one last time. You just went still. That stillness carries more weight than any confrontation ever could. Because when a man who once gave everything chooses silence, it's not silence anymore. It's a declaration. Not to her. Not to the world, but to himself. A declaration that says, I no longer abandon myself to keep someone else comfortable. You were once so predictable, predictable in your kindness, predictable in your loyalty, predictable in your pain. And in that predictability, you became easy to dismiss. Familiarity made her blind to your effort. She confused your consistency with weakness. She thought your patience meant you had nowhere else to go. But people change when they're pushed past the point of return. And when a man finally sees what he deserves, he stops asking for what he doesn't. That's where your silence was born, from truth. From knowing that being available to the wrong person only delays your path to the right one. Now she faces something she never prepared for, your absence. Not physical absence, emotional, energetic, the absence of your attention, the absence of your inner world being open to her. That absence stings in a way words never could, because the human mind fills silence with fear. It imagines everything it took for granted suddenly moving on, rising, thriving, and that image haunts the ego more than anything. She didn't think you'd become the one who let go first. But letting go isn't weakness. It's wisdom. It's what happens when you stop holding space for someone who only shows up when they feel you slipping away. You've stopped waiting for change in places that never honored your growth. That's why this silence feels different. It's not empty. It's full of direction. It's full of a new standard. And that standard is simple. You don't chase what confuses you. You don't hold on to what drains you. And you don't return to what broke you. That's not ego. That's evolution. This is where your life begins to take on new shape. Not because she noticed your absence, but because you finally noticed your own value. The kind of value that doesn't need to shout, that doesn't need to prove, that just is. Quiet, unapologetic, unavailable to the things that once kept you small. Your silence is not the end of the story. It's the first sentence of a new chapter. A chapter written by a man who stopped asking to be chosen and started choosing himself. That's why the silence holds power. Because it didn't come from pride. It came from peace. And peace is louder than anything she ever said. True peace isn't loud. It doesn't come with closure or validation. It doesn't need to be seen, heard, or explained. It simply arrives when you stop needing to be understood by someone who refused to understand you when it mattered. That's what makes your silence so powerful now. It's not an absence, it's a presence they can no longer access. It's the undeniable energy of a man who has returned to himself, reclaimed his time, and refused to entertain anything that disrespects his growth. That kind of silence doesn't just create space, it creates a mirror. And now she's forced to sit with her reflection without your voice softening the truth. That silence is her consequence, but your breakthrough. Because when you no longer feel the urge to defend your worth, that's when you've truly stepped into your power. You don't need her to admit what she did. You don't need her to miss you out loud. You've released yourself from the trap of needing someone else's guilt to validate your decision to walk away. That's freedom. And not everyone gets there. Most stay trapped in cycles, needing closure, needing a reaction, needing to be seen one last time. But you've risen past that. You've realized the most healing closure is not what they say, it's what you decide. Now your silence has become discipline. And discipline is the ultimate self-respect. It's not that you don't feel, It's that you've chosen to stop bleeding for someone who never brought you a bandage. You've chosen to hold your ground, even when the temptation to reach back whispers in your mind. Because you know what waits on the other side of that silence isn't pain, it's rebirth. The rebuilding of your identity without the weight of someone who made you question your value. There's something unshakable in a man who has mastered that kind of self-control. He doesn't argue, he doesn't beg, he doesn't react. He simply observes, chooses, and continues walking forward, not because he's numb, but because he's focused, because every step away from chaos is a step toward purpose. That is who you are becoming now, a man no longer defined by who left, who stayed, or who regrets, but by who he decided to become when it was all quiet. You've tapped into a version of yourself that she didn't believe you had the strength to reach. That's what unsettles her most. Not that you left, but that you never looked back, that your silence isn't a tactic. It's a truth. You are no longer available for confusion, no longer waiting for understanding. You are no longer lingering in spaces that shrink your spirit. And when a man chooses that kind of stillness, the world adjusts. She adjusts. Not because you asked her to, but because power never begs. It never pleads. It just is. Silent, grounded, untouchable. And now, so are you. You used to explain your silence. You used to make sure she didn't misunderstand your distance. You softened your absence with reassurance, always afraid she might take it the wrong way. But now, you've let go of that burden. You no longer carry the responsibility of managing someone else's emotions while yours go ignored. You've stopped translating your pain into words that make others comfortable. Your silence no longer asks to be understood. It stands firm with no apology, no explanation, no need to be softened. Because when you begin honoring yourself, you stop bending for people who only listen when it's convenient for them. She feels that shift, not through your words, but through your absence, through the space you used to fill with effort, patience, and understanding. That space is empty now, and in that emptiness, she's left to feel what you felt, the indifference, the uncertainty, the disconnect. But unlike before, you're not trying to fix what broke. You've accepted that some connections aren't meant to be saved. They're meant to wake you up. And that wake-up call has given you clarity. Your worth was never tied to how much you endured. You gave her more than chances. You gave her access to your heart, your mind, your vulnerability. And now that access is revoked, not out of spite, but out of wisdom, because your energy is no longer available for people who can't handle its weight. You've learned what happens when you stay too long in places that don't nourish you. You lose yourself. And now that you've found yourself again, you protect that man with everything you've got. You protect his time, his spirit, his future. That's what this silence represents. It's not distance. It's protection. A sacred boundary around everything you almost lost, trying to be enough for someone who never saw the depth of what you gave. You didn't just go silent. You reclaimed your power. And that power doesn't need to convince. It doesn't chase. It doesn't ask to be welcomed back. Because when you finally understand your value, you become the door, not the one waiting outside of it. She expected you to return like before, to explain, to make it easier. But growth rarely looks how people expect. Growth is quiet. It's unannounced. It doesn't ask permission. Now she's left with the echo of who you used to be and the absence of the man you've become. And the silence between the two is where your power lives. You're not hiding. You're not waiting. You're not lost. You're building. You're healing. You're stepping into a version of yourself that doesn't need her presence to feel whole. That is what makes you untouchable now. Not the silence itself, but the reason behind it. A reason rooted in self-worth, in peace, in unwavering direction. You've stopped knocking on doors that stayed closed too long. And in doing so, you've opened the one that matters most, the one within. There's a certain kind of peace that comes when you no longer feel the need to be chosen. When you no longer wait to be noticed, remembered, or pursued. It's not that you stopped caring. It's that you finally realized caring doesn't mean sacrificing your self-respect. You've stopped attaching your value to someone else's recognition. You've stopped placing your worth in hands that fumbled it without hesitation. And in that moment, when you chose to go silent, you made a decision far deeper than walking away. You reclaimed the narrative. The story was no longer about who left. It became about who awakened. Now the silence holds weight, not as a weapon, but as a signal. A quiet, steady pulse of your inner alignment. You've realigned your focus, not on revenge, not on proving a point, but on building a life where you are no longer available for emotional shortcuts, half-love, or inconsistent presence. You stopped being addicted to potential and finally looked at the reality. You saw who was willing and who was simply comfortable. And when that truth sank in, so did your detachment. Detachment isn't indifference, it's strength. It's looking at what once moved you to tears and feeling nothing but peace. It's realizing that not every connection is meant to last forever, and that's okay. You stopped confusing loyalty with endurance. You stopped calling pain love just because you were afraid to let go. And now that you've let go, you can finally breathe without checking who's holding space for you, because you're holding it for yourself. She underestimated the silence. She saw it as temporary, a phase, a moment of distance that would pass like the others. But what she missed was that this silence was different. This one came from knowing, from growth, from finality. And there's nothing more unshakable than a man who knows he gave his best and walks away anyway. Not because he was ignored, but because he was done ignoring himself. You no longer respond to confusion. You no longer explain yourself to ears that only hear when they feel your absence. You no longer show up just to be forgotten again. This silence, this stillness, it's not the pause before the return, it's the full stop, the closed chapter, the clear boundary between what you were willing to give and what was never reciprocated. That boundary protects more than your heart. It protects your future, because now your future is yours. It's no longer dependent on who stays or who sees your worth. It's no longer built around proving that you're enough. You already are. And as you walk forward, quietly, steadily, with no need to be seen, your silence says everything. It says you've outgrown the need to be heard in spaces that never truly listened. It says your time is sacred now, and anyone who wants access to it will have to meet you where you are, not where you lowered yourself to be. You never owed anyone your suffering. You never had to prove your loyalty by breaking yourself in silence while someone else moved through life unaffected by your pain. That lesson took time to learn. But now you've learned it, and it shows in your quiet strength. You no longer wear your hurt like a badge. You don't broadcast your healing. You simply move differently, with more purpose, with more protection over your peace, with more discipline in where your energy flows. That shift is what makes your silence so heavy. It's not passive, it's chosen. It's the kind of choice that changes your life from the inside out. You've stopped answering questions that should have never been asked. You've stopped giving second chances to someone who never appreciated the first. You've realized that love without respect is manipulation dressed as romance. And now, you don't chase love, you don't chase closure, you don't chase anyone. You let everything that belongs in your life come to you with clarity, consistency, and care. Anything less doesn't even get a response, not out of arrogance, but out of alignment. That's what happens when a man evolves. He no longer places his identity in someone else's opinion of him. He no longer tries to fit into spaces that shrink his soul. He no longer entertains people who are only around when it's easy. You've become the type of man who holds space only for those who show up fully. And that version of you? That version is unrecognizable to the one who thought you'd always be waiting. She expected the version of you who couldn't let go, who clung to hope even when it hurt, who kept showing up long after he should have walked away. But that man is gone, and in his place stands someone who understands that silence can be love too, the kind of love you give to yourself when no one else did. You're not trying to hurt anyone with your distance. You're simply done hurting yourself with your closeness. You've realized something critical. Peace feels better than attention. Silence feels better than arguments. Stillness feels better than constantly justifying your heart to someone who never protected it. Now you choose peace over chaos, even if it means walking alone for a while, because walking alone with dignity is better than walking with someone who makes you feel alone while standing beside them. Your silence is not emptiness. It's power contained. It's healing in progress. It's growth unfolding in real time. And anyone who thought they could manipulate you through your empathy no longer has access. You've sealed that door, not with hate, but with understanding. And in that understanding, you've built a boundary that feels like freedom. You're not the same, and you're not supposed to be. Growth doesn't come to the comfortable. It comes to those who are finally willing to stop explaining their worth and start living it. That's the man you are now. Quiet, strong, free. You've stopped responding to situations that once pulled you into chaos, not because you don't feel, but because you finally understand that not every emotion deserves a reaction. Not every trigger deserves your energy. You're not avoiding conflict. You're choosing peace. You're not running. You're rising. Because the man who has faced the storm and survived no longer chases the wind. He knows the cost of pouring into people who can't hold what he gives. He knows what it feels like to beg for connection, to stretch himself thin for crumbs of affection. And he's done, not bitter, just clear, not cold, just wise. What she never expected was for you to become untouchable, not by distance, but by growth. She was used to your emotion, your passion, your persistence, but she never prepared for your emotional independence. That shift is everything. It's the moment you stopped being a prisoner to your feelings and started being a master of them. Now you respond with presence, not panic, with thought, not impulse, with silence, not desperation. That silence is not the absence of love, it's the presence of boundaries. And those boundaries are not walls, they're doors. Doors that only open for what brings alignment, not attachment. You've stopped over-explaining your soul. You've stopped pleading to be seen. The right ones don't need to be convinced. The right ones feel your energy. They respect it. And now you do too. That's what changed everything. Not just how she sees you, but how you see yourself. You no longer need her understanding to move forward. You no longer need her permission to heal. You've granted yourself that permission. And once a man gives himself that, nothing and no one can take it away. You don't need to win anymore. You don't need to prove you were right. Growth has replaced ego. Peace has replaced pride. Silence has replaced noise. You've learned that real power is quiet. It's internal. It doesn't look like dominance. It looks like detachment from anything that threatens your wholeness. The world teaches men to fight for what they love, but it rarely teaches them to walk away when love becomes war. You've learned both. You loved fully, and you let go wisely. That's what makes you powerful now. Not because you won, but because you didn't lose yourself trying to be chosen. She may never say it, but she feels it. The absence of your presence, the depth of your detachment, the weight of your silence. And that silence will echo longer than your voice ever did, because it wasn't just quiet, it was final. Not in anger, but in evolution. And evolution doesn't go backward. You're not waiting to be missed. You're not hoping to be remembered. You've stepped into a space where peace is non-negotiable, where your energy is earned, not assumed. You're not looking back, not because you forgot, but because you finally remembered who you are. And that man doesn't need to speak to be heard. He just moves, and everything around him feels it. When you finally choose silence over proving your point, you win a war no one else can see, not a war with her, a war within yourself. The battle between who you used to be, the one who needed to be heard, needed to be right, needed to be chosen, and the man you've become. The one who no longer seeks validation and reaction. The one who's done performing for attention that was never consistent. This version of you is grounded, calm, and immovable. Not because you don't care, but because you finally care the right way. By protecting your energy like it's sacred, because it is. You've stopped explaining why you left the table. You've stopped apologizing for no longer participating in conversations that only lead to confusion. There's no reward in staying where you are constantly misunderstood, where you are only valued in your absence. You understand now that being missed is not the same as being respected, and you're not here to be missed. You're here to be met fully, deeply, without conditions. If that can't happen, you walk. Not with bitterness, but with a quiet resolve that speaks louder than any final word ever could. Your silence is not emptiness. It's full of everything you've learned. It's full of restraint, self-awareness, and emotional intelligence. That's what creates power. Not control over others, but control over yourself. When you no longer allow your emotions to be hijacked by someone else's inconsistency, you become unstoppable. Because now, nothing can pull you into a storm you didn't invite. Nothing can make you abandon yourself to chase someone who's still deciding whether you're enough. She didn't see this coming. Not because you hit it, but because she thought you would always bend. But even steel breaks under enough pressure. And once it breaks, it doesn't bend anymore. It reforges. That's what you've done. You've reforged into someone who doesn't chase closure, doesn't beg for understanding, and doesn't return just because someone finally realized your worth. That realization came too late. And you've moved too far. You don't need them to know how hard it was to walk away. You don't need to defend your silence. You've learned that silence is the defense. Silence is the boundary. Silence is the answer to every question they never asked while they had the chance. And in that stillness, you've rebuilt everything. Your focus, your peace, your direction. And none of it depends on being heard. It depends on being true to yourself, to your values, to your path. This is what real transformation feels like. Not loud, not dramatic, just solid, just undeniable. You're not who you were. You've risen from the ashes of misunderstanding, disappointment, and self-doubt into a man who no longer explains himself to be accepted, because acceptance means nothing if it costs your soul. Now, your soul is intact, your voice is quiet, and your presence is unforgettable. When you reach the point where silence feels stronger than shouting, you've tapped into a rare kind of power, the kind that doesn't waver when tested, the kind that doesn't tremble in the face of rejection. You don't break anymore. You absorb, process, and rise, because the man who's been torn apart by disappointment learns how to stitch himself back together with discipline. He learns how to move with precision instead of reaction. He learns how to guard his peace like it's a non-negotiable part of his purpose. That's where you are now. Quietly, deeply aligned with the version of yourself who finally stopped needing to be rescued. It's no longer about being wanted. It's about being respected. You don't crave attention, you crave alignment. You don't chase connection. You attract it through consistency and calm. And if it doesn't match that energy, it doesn't get access. That boundary doesn't make you hard. It makes you healed. You've seen what happens when you let people too close without requiring emotional responsibility. You've felt the drain, the confusion, the chaos that follows when your standards are too low and your empathy too high. But you've reset the scale. Now your strength is measured by what you don't tolerate. You've reached the point where your silence doesn't come from defeat, but from detachment. Not apathy, just clarity. You've detached from the outcomes you can't control. You've stopped rewriting chapters that already ended. You've stopped watering dead plants, hoping they'll bloom. You've accepted that sometimes peace requires distance and healing requires space. That understanding didn't make you colder. It made you cleaner. You've stripped away what no longer serves you. And in that shedding, you became untouchable. Not because you built walls, but because you raised your standards. She didn't expect this version of you. The one who doesn't reach out when he's hurt. The one who doesn't argue when misunderstood. The one who doesn't chase closure from someone who created the confusion. She expected reaction, maybe even retaliation. But you gave her none of it. You gave her silence, not out of spite, but out of strength. Because when you know who you are, you stop performing for people who never valued the real you to begin with. You no longer explain the cost of your absence. You no longer wait to be seen. You see yourself. You respect yourself. And because of that, you walk with a calm that cannot be faked. That calm is earned through trials, through heartbreak, through the kind of growth that hurts but frees. And now that you've tasted that freedom, you'll never trade it again. Not for love, not for attention, not for nostalgia. You've learned that the most powerful response is no response. That your silence says everything they were too distracted to hear when you were speaking. And now that you're silent, they finally feel what they never listened to. But it's too late, because you're no longer available for conversations that cost your peace. There comes a moment when you realize your energy is sacred. Not just important, sacred. The way you think, the way you love, the way you care, it's not for everyone. Not because you're better than anyone, but because you've finally accepted that not everyone is capable of receiving you with the depth and clarity you deserve. That's not arrogance. That's self-respect. And once that seed takes root in your soul, you stop handing out access like it's free. You begin to measure people not by their intentions, but by their consistency, not by their words, but by their actions. And when the two don't align, you leave without protest. This is what maturity looks like. Quiet exits, peaceful boundaries, clean breaks. Not because you've lost feeling, but because you've gained vision. You see what's beneath the surface. You recognize patterns faster. You spot red flags without needing to touch them. You hear the silence between their words and understand what isn't being said. That kind of awareness doesn't just protect your heart, it rebuilds it. Because when you stop trying to change others and start changing how you respond, your whole life shifts. You stop giving second chances to people who waste first ones. You stop waiting for apologies from people who can't own their damage. You stop breaking your back to carry relationships that should have been mutual. And that shift, it's not loud, it's not bitter, it's solid. You don't scream about your worth. You embody it. You don't explain why you've gone quiet. You let your absence do the explaining, and it does, loudly, because silence isn't empty. It echoes. Your peace now speaks for you. It tells the world that you've stopped engaging with chaos, that your heart no longer plays in emotional minefields, that your time, your presence, your mind, it's earned, not owed. And when people finally realize what they lost, you don't come back. Not to prove a point, but to protect your progress. Because healing isn't just about recovery. It's about what you no longer accept once you're whole. You've outgrown the version of yourself that needed to be understood by everyone. You don't seek closure where peace has already been made. You don't keep doors cracked open for people who walked away without looking back. And that decision doesn't make you unkind. It makes you focused, because now you're building. Building a life that's rooted in inner strength, not outer approval. Building habits that support peace, not patterns that drain you. Building relationships based on truth, not potential. And when you move like that, you move with power. Silent, grounded, unmistakable power. The kind that doesn't ask to be seen, but is impossible to ignore. You no longer need to chase anything. Not attention, not love, not closure. Because everything you thought you needed from others, you found within. And that's the difference. That's what makes the silence so loud. It's the sound of a man who finally came home to himself. When a man comes home to himself, everything changes, not just how he walks, but where he's walking. Not just what he does, but why he does it. The noise that once shook him no longer has weight. The people who once had control no longer have a key. He no longer reacts to opinions that once pierced his spirit. Why? Because clarity kills confusion. And when a man finds clarity, he no longer seeks validation. He becomes his own compass. Quiet, direct, unshakable. That shift isn't just about silence. It's about control. Not control over others, but control over self. The emotions that used to explode now move through you like wind. You feel them. You don't fight them. But you don't let them drive. You observe. You respond with purpose. That's not detachment. That's discipline. Emotional discipline. And most people don't understand how powerful it is to feel everything, but still choose peace. That's what makes you different now. You're no longer ruled by what happens around you. You're ruled by what's been built within you. You've stopped trying to be chosen. You choose yourself. You choose your standards. You choose your solitude when noise tries to pull you off center. And when people say you've changed, you don't flinch. Of course you've changed. That's what growth demands. You're not supposed to remain in the shape someone else molded you into. You're not here to fit in. You're here to evolve. And evolution never asks for permission. It just arrives, and those who can't handle it will label it cold. But it's not cold. It's clear. You no longer explain your silence. You just maintain it. Not as a punishment to others, but as a promise to yourself. A promise that your peace will not be traded for attention, that your truth will not be diluted to make others comfortable, that your time will not be spent repairing what others keep breaking. You've learned that presence is a gift, not a guarantee. And if someone doesn't treat it as such, they don't get to keep it. You're not bitter. You're better, more focused, more calm, more honest. You see things as they are, not as you wish they'd be. And that kind of clarity forces decisions. You either accept what drains you, or you walk toward what strengthens you. And once you taste that strength, you never go back. Because backward means breaking your own heart just to keep someone in your life who couldn't even handle your truth. Let them wonder why you stopped reaching out. Let them question your silence. Let them feel the absence they once ignored. That's not revenge. That's reality. You didn't go silent to hurt anyone. You went silent to hear yourself, to realign with the man who no longer begs to be seen, because he sees himself now, fully, deeply, unapologetically. And that man doesn't explain his peace, or he protects it with silence, with presence, with power. Not everyone is meant to walk with you once you rise. The higher you climb, the more silence you'll face. Not because people are gone, but because noise can't survive in altitude. Growth filters out what was only meant to feed your lower self. The version of you that used to explain your worth, that used to beg to be heard, that tolerated what went against your values just to feel wanted, that version doesn't belong where you're going, and deep down, you know it. That's why you've stopped chasing what was never aligned in the first place. That's why you've become more distant from drama and closer to stillness. You don't owe the world access to your transformation. You owe it to yourself to stay loyal to your growth. When they ask why you're different, you smile. Not because you don't have words, but because you no longer waste them on those who listen only to reply. You've discovered a truth that most people avoid. Silence isn't emptiness, it's elevation. It's the space where you find your edge again, the edge they tried to soften, tame, and reshape. But you reclaimed it. And with it, you reclaimed your voice. Not the one that speaks, but the one that acts without noise. The one that chooses peace over pride. Boundaries over excuses, self-respect over comfort. You've learned that not everyone deserves closure. Not everyone deserves a front row seat to your healing. Some only want to witness your pain, not your power. But now you've made peace with the fact that some chapters end without a final sentence. Some relationships break without a final argument. And that's okay. You're not here to collect apologies. You're here to reclaim your focus. Because focus is the gateway to freedom. Not external freedom, the freedom that lives inside. The freedom that no one can touch because it comes from knowing who you are and what you will no longer allow. They may wonder how you detached so calmly, how you disappeared without noise, how you moved on without ceremony. But you know. You remember the nights when you gave too much, the days you stayed quiet to keep peace for others while you crumbled inside. That version of you didn't walk away bitter. He walked away wiser, stronger, sharper. And now? You're no longer moved by guilt. You're moved by alignment. You don't respond to everything. You reserve your energy for what builds you. You've stopped fighting for places where your spirit was only tolerated, never celebrated. Let them think you've changed. You have. Let them miss the old version of you. That version no longer exists. Because now you don't flinch when the door closes. You don't chase footsteps that walked away. You trust that your silence is a message, and the right ones will hear it, not through words. Through presence, through energy, through the weight of a man who knows exactly who he is and refuses to explain that to anyone not ready to understand. When you finally learn to sit with yourself in silence, you stop chasing people who make noise just to feel important. You begin to crave depth over attention, meaning over validation. And in that space, the world starts to feel different. You see through the distractions, the games, the manipulation disguised as love. What once pulled you in now pushes you away. What once felt like connection now reveals itself as control. And you, finally free from the need to be understood by everyone, choose peace, even if it means walking alone. That shift is sacred. It means you've matured past emotional hunger, past the desperation to prove you're enough. You no longer measure your value by who stays or who claps for you. You measure it by how true you remain to your inner standard, especially when no one's watching, especially when it's hard. That's power. Not the loud, flashy kind. The quiet, grounded kind. The kind that doesn't beg, that doesn't explain, that simply moves, calmly, intentionally, forward. There's a deep strength in the man who doesn't react, who doesn't get pulled into every storm, who feels everything but chooses not to be ruled by emotion. That's not coldness, that's discipline. And discipline is the foundation of freedom. Because when you stop reacting to everything that tries to trigger you, you regain control. You stop being a puppet to other people's chaos. You become the storm they can't predict, the calm they can't shake, the silence they never saw coming. The hardest part isn't leaving, it's staying gone. Staying quiet when your ego screams to be heard. Staying focused when your old wounds ache to be reopened. But you know now, every time you choose silence, you choose power, not avoidance, not weakness, power. Because you no longer fight battles that are beneath you. You no longer answer questions that insult your intelligence. You no longer argue just to be right. You choose to be whole. And wholeness doesn't need noise. It needs clarity. Clarity that says, I don't move unless it aligns with my peace. They might call it arrogance. Let them. They called your kindness weakness too. They misunderstood your silence then, just like they'll misunderstand it now. But you're not here to be understood. You're here to evolve, to master yourself, to build a life so solid it doesn't shatter every time someone leaves. That's what silence teaches you. How to stand in your truth without needing an audience. How to walk away without slamming doors. How to let people go without needing them to see your worth first. You've already seen it. That's why you're silent now. Not because you gave up, but because you finally woke up. And waking up means no longer trying to fix what was never your job to carry. It means no longer shrinking to fit into their expectations. It means rising, alone if necessary, but always in alignment. And when you move from that place, nothing can stop you. Because now, even your silence speaks volumes. Not everyone deserves access to you. Not everyone deserves to hear your heart or witness your growth. And when you realize that, you stop over-explaining. You stop trying to prove your value to people who only ever saw you as an option. You start treating your presence like a privilege because it is. Your energy, your time, your attention, your peace, these are sacred. You don't just hand them out to anyone who notices you when it's convenient. You protect them fiercely, quietly, relentlessly. That's what going silent really means. It's not about bitterness. It's not revenge. It's a boundary. A boundary that says, you no longer get to disturb what I fought so hard to build within. And the strength to enforce that boundary doesn't come from anger. It comes from healing, from the work you did in silence, from the tears no one saw, from the nights you kept going when it felt easier to fall back into old patterns. That's why you don't owe anyone a dramatic exit, just your absence, just your peace, just your refusal to stay small for the sake of their comfort. You used to think silence was weakness, that if you didn't explain, they wouldn't understand, that if you didn't defend yourself, they'd assume the worst. But now you know better. You've learned that silence is clarity, that explaining yourself to the wrong person is just another way of betraying your truth, that the right people never needed an explanation in the first place. They recognized your value without you needing to prove it. And the wrong ones? No amount of explaining would have been enough, because they weren't listening to understand. They were listening to control. So you went silent. And in doing so, you reclaimed your power. You stopped begging to be seen and decided to see yourself. You stopped waiting for closure and gave it to yourself. You stopped needing someone else to validate your worth and began building a life that reflected it. A life grounded in discipline, in direction, in inner peace that doesn't get shaken by temporary emotions or shallow praise. That's the shift, that's the transformation. And it's one no one else can give you. When you master silence, you master self-respect. You stop negotiating with people who don't value your presence. You stop watering dead gardens. You stop showing up to conversations that go nowhere. And instead, you invest that energy back into your goals, your mindset, your next chapter. Because you finally understand that the people meant for you will never ask you to betray yourself just to keep them. You're not cold. You're clear. You're not distant. You're focused. You're not bitter. You're better. And the silence they once dismissed is now the loudest proof of your growth. So stay quiet, stay grounded, stay on your path, because every step you take in silence is building a future too strong to be shaken. And the more they wonder where you went, the more they'll realize you never needed to stay.